The 1960s was a decade of intense social, economic, political, and culture change for Canada. People everywhere began to realize what it truly meant to be a Canadian. In the early 60s, the Bill of Rights was enforced by John Diefenbaker, the Prime Minister of Canada during this era. In the 1960s, Quebec was going through what was called the Quiet Revolution, under the command and control of Jean Lesage. Once elected, Lesage changed and manipulated Quebec's view on their culture and society. Protests started, and Quebecers began demanding more say in Canadian political decisions. Quebec wanted Canada to revolve around the French language. Quebec also made many changes on the home front. Schools were no longer run by churches or parishes, but instead, the government was taking on its roles. The government became a bigger part in Quebec's daily lives. Protests and frenzies in Quebec continued on for the rest of this decade, for their province was becoming more modernized rapidly. But Quebecers were not the only ones protesting in Canada. Women began to as well. Women in Canada were fed up with gender bias, sexism, and unequal working partnerships with men. They became influenced by American women rights protests, and so began the feminist movement of 1960, which brought realization to the treatment of women in Canadian societies and culture. Women were starting to take demand and protest for what they wanted. The New Democratic Party, or NDP, was formed in the 1960s and gave a voice to those unheard. This party supported workers, farmers, women, and feminists, and became their voice in politics. Young Canadians needed more of a say in politics, and by 1965 that chance had come when Pierre Elliott Trudeau arrived. He believed in order to better Canada, more young Quebec politicians need to be active. Not only was Canada growing politically, but economically things were expanding. American chains such as Dairy Queen, A&W, and McDonald's began to branch off into Canada in the 60s and provided jobs for many Canadians. GDP was at 41.09 and exports, imports, and employment rates were succeeding. On May 17th, Canadians in Montreal experienced terror from a bomb attack. Many events like this began to occur. The 1960s were a big year for Canada culturally. Canada was one step closer to their own identity as many designs and decisions for Canada's flag, a promise by Prime Minister Pearson, began to be brought up. And after a long heated debate by the formal House of Commons, on February 15th, Canada had its very own flag, proving our Canadian identity. In 1967, Canada celebrated its 100th birthday, with many festivities like visits from the Queen, celebrations on Parliament Hill, and many more. One of the largest celebrations was the lighting of the Centennial Flame on Parliament Hill. Another large celebration which took place was the hosting of Expo 67, where Canadians and Canada was able to truly show their success and nationhood through architecture and design. As decades come and go, fashion follows. In the 60s, diversity in fashion became extremely popular. Teens' clothing, as well as women's clothing, and men's was becoming much more advertised. Women and teens wore shorter skirts and shorter dresses. Bathing suits were often made and advertised with more personal designs, and they were often put in magazines as bikinis. Influence in fashion mostly came from the United States as well. Hippie fashion influenced Canadians and began to become a huge trend. There was also many different hairstyles in the 60s. Women either wore a short bob or grew out their hair, while men used more hair products and slicked back their hair. Music and entertainment in Canada began to get more popular and expand to other countries during the 60s. In 1964 to 65, Beatlemania arrived in Canada, and teens everywhere were overjoyed and pleased with this music. The 60s were a time of success, nationhood, and identity growth for Canada.